For years, Pablo Escobar lived by a rule so simple that everyone around him knew it by heart. Never stay in one place for too long, never trust anyone completely, and above all, never use the telephone. Escobar understood something that many criminals failed to grasp until it was too late. A single conversation could be more dangerous than a gunfight. A phone call could reveal a location, expose a network, and bring years of hiding to an abrupt end. Yet in the final days of his life, the man who built one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in history began ignoring the very principles that had kept him alive. What happened during the last 72 hours of Pablo Escobar's life is not merely the story of a fugitive being hunted, it is the story of a man watching his empire collapse around him, a man running out of options, and a man making decisions that would ultimately lead him to his final confrontation. By late 1993, Escobar was no longer the untouchable kingpin he had once been. Only a few years earlier, he had stood at the peak of his power. His Medellín Cartel had generated unimaginable wealth. His influence reached politicians, businessmen, police officers, and entire communities. He had become one of the most feared and recognizable criminals on the planet. But power has a way of creating enemies, and Escobar had spent years accumulating them. The Colombian government wanted him captured. American agencies were assisting the hunt. Rival traffickers wanted him dead. Former allies had turned against him. A violent vigilante organization dedicated to destroying his network was relentlessly pursuing anyone connected to him. The walls were closing in from every direction. The pressure was unlike anything Escobar had ever faced before. Many of his most trusted associates were dead. Others had been arrested. The network that once protected him had been severely weakened. Safe houses became harder to find. Loyal supporters became increasingly difficult to trust. Every day brought new uncertainty. Every new location carried fresh risks. The man who once commanded an empire now spent his days moving from one hiding place to another, never knowing whether the next knock on the door would come from a friend or an enemy. What made the situation even worse was the fate of his family. Throughout his criminal career, Escobar had justified many of his actions by claiming they were necessary to protect those closest to him. Now, however, he found himself unable to guarantee their safety. His wife and children were living under constant pressure. Their movements were restricted. Their future was uncertain. Reports of threats, political complications, and failed attempts to leave the country only added to his frustration. For a man accustomed to controlling every situation, helplessness became a new and unfamiliar enemy. Those who encountered Escobar during this period described someone very different from the larger-than-life figure portrayed in newspapers. Instead of the confident kingpin who once negotiated with governments, they saw a man burdened by exhaustion. He remained cautious, but cracks were beginning to appear. The stress of living as a fugitive was taking its toll. Sleep became difficult. Decisions became harder. The relentless pressure of survival began to erode the discipline that had defined his years on the run. As the final days approached, Escobar sought refuge among a small circle of trusted individuals. These relationships were built not on business, but on personal loyalty. In a world where betrayal had become common, family connections offered a rare sense of security. Yet even the safest refuge could not shield him from the reality that his options were rapidly disappearing. Every passing day increased the chances that someone would discover his whereabouts. Every interaction carried risks. Every conversation had consequences. Despite the danger, there were moments during those final days when normal life briefly resurfaced. Simple conversations, shared meals, familiar faces. These moments may have seemed insignificant at the time, but they stood in sharp contrast to the chaos surrounding him. For a brief period, Escobar experienced something he had not felt in a long time, a sense of routine. Yet beneath the surface, the reality remained unchanged. He was still the most wanted man in Colombia. The hunt continued around the clock. One of the most remarkable aspects of Escobar's final days was the growing contradiction between what he knew and what he did. He understood the dangers of communication better than almost anyone. He had spent years teaching associates how to avoid surveillance. He knew the importance of minimizing exposure. He knew that intelligence units were constantly searching for opportunities to locate him. Yet emotional pressure can alter judgment. Concern for family, isolation, fatigue, and frustration began influencing decisions that once would have been unthinkable. The psychological burden of his situation cannot be underestimated. Imagine spending months unable to move freely. Imagine living in constant fear of betrayal. Imagine knowing that powerful organizations were dedicating enormous resources to finding you. Over time, even the most disciplined individuals begin making mistakes. Small exceptions become larger ones, rules become suggestions, precautions become inconveniences. The line between caution and desperation starts to blur. Meanwhile, the forces hunting Escobar continued refining their methods. Colombian authorities, supported by intelligence cooperation and advanced tracking capabilities, remained committed to ending the manhunt. Years of effort had already gone into the operation. Investigators analyzed patterns, monitored potential contacts, and followed every lead they could obtain. The pursuit was not based on a single breakthrough. It was the result of countless hours of surveillance, coordination, and persistence. As December arrived, Escobar's confidence appeared increasingly fragile. Some accounts describe him as reflective, others describe him as restless. Whatever the exact reality, there is little doubt that he understood the severity of his situation. He had survived many crises throughout his life, but this one felt different. The support system that once sustained him had largely disappeared. The options available to him were becoming fewer by the day. Then came the decisions that would change everything. The details remain debated by historians, journalists, and former participants in the manhunt, but the broad picture is clear. Escobar increased contact with people he trusted. Communication became more frequent. Conversations became longer. In another phase of his life, he might have avoided such risks entirely. But circumstances had changed. Emotion was beginning to outweigh caution. Every call created an opportunity. Every minute created a clue. And every clue brought investigators closer. What makes this story so compelling is not simply that a criminal was captured. History is filled with criminals who were eventually caught. What makes this story remarkable is the irony. The very individual who understood operational security better than almost anyone ultimately became vulnerable because he stopped following his own rules. His downfall was not caused by a sudden betrayal or a dramatic shootout alone. It was a process, a gradual erosion of discipline under extraordinary pressure. As investigators narrowed their focus, the final chapter of the manhunt began unfolding. The years of violence, political turmoil, and international attention were approaching their conclusion. Escobar may not have known precisely how close authorities were, but the tension surrounding him suggested that he understood danger was near. The question was no longer whether the hunt would end, the question was when. On the morning of December 2nd, 1993, that answer finally arrived. The events that followed would become one of the most famous operations in modern criminal history. Within hours, the world's most wanted drug trafficker would be dead. The empire he had built would effectively come to an end. The legend, however, would continue growing for decades. But perhaps the most important lesson from Escobar's final days has little to do with crime and everything to do with human nature. Power creates confidence. Success creates habits. Survival creates rules. Yet when pressure becomes overwhelming, even the people who create those rules can abandon them. And sometimes the mistake that changes history is not a dramatic act of recklessness. Sometimes it is simply one more phone call. In our next episode, we will examine the operation itself, the intelligence work, the search teams, the final pursuit through Medellin, and the controversial circumstances surrounding the death of Pablo Escobar.